hypothetical consent. Perhaps in the contemplation of the problem that best attempts to show that we have consented to obey the law, some thinkers from Hobbes 1651-1996 onwards have adopted the alternative claim that we would, if the state did not already exist, set up a state and consent to obey its law. This is sometimes called hypothetical consent or hypothetical contract consent, that we would give in an imagined situation that does not match the reality. A key challenge for the hypothetical consent theorists is to show why it matters what we would do rather than we have in fact done. It is easy to see why our actual consent to obey the law should bind us for the law, but why should our hypothetical consent bind us to the law? The worry, as Ronald Dawkins puts in, is that a hypothetical contract is not simply a pale from the actual contract. It is no contract at all. Hypothetical consent theories have tried to respond to this challenge in a number of different ways. Central to these responses is often the claim that by looking at hypothetical consent, we can determine that it would be rational for us to agree to, even if we were purely seeking. But again, one might reasonably, page number 17, one might reasonably challenge the hypothetical consent theorists to explain why we would care what if it would be rational for us to do, when in reality we might prefer to act irrationally. If the hypothetical consent theorist replies along the lines of because it is in your best interest to do what it is rational to do, then it looks like his or her arrangement for political authority and obligation appeals to the benefits that the state brings rather than on the moral importance of consent. But if hypothetical consent theorist's argument relies ultimately on the benefit that the state brings, then hypothetical consent seems to drop out of the picture. That is, we might as well seek to justify political obligation and authority by direct reference to the benefit that the state brings. In next section we will look at the precisely this possibility. Utilitarianism. One reason to think we should obey the law regardless of the presence or absence of the consent is that obedience to the law allows the state to exist, and that of the existence of the state brings us many benefits. We have roads to drive down, policy to keep the peace within our borders, and armies to protect our borders. Some of us are lucky enough to enjoy access to free and heavily subsidized health care and education. Are these benefits not themselves sufficient justification for political authority and obligation? Page number 18. The answer to this question is both yes and no. For those who want to act in ways that benefit the society, the benefit that the society brings will provide a reason to obey the law. But those who are less motivated to benefit the society, or those who want to reap the benefits of others' obedience without paying the cost, will not regard the benefit that the state brings as a reason for them to obey the law. If we want to show that everyone has a duty to obey the law, then we must show that not only that obedience to the law by permitting the state of exist benefit the society, we must also show that everyone has a duty to act in ways that society. The moral theory best placed to ground the claim that everyone has a duty to act in the ways the society is utilitarianism. First proposed by Jeremy Bentham in the late 18th century. Utilitarianism says that everything we do should aims to maximize the amount of pleasure and minimize the amount of pain in the world. It does not matter whose pleasure or pain is at stake. What is important is overall aggregated balance of pleasure over pains in across everyone. Whenever we have a choice about to act, we should always choose the options that best fulfills the aim. One objection immediately arises to any attempt to use utilitarianism as grounding for political authority and obligation. If someone is deciding whether to obey or to break the law on a particular occasion, then surely according to utilitarianism, he or she ought to choose whichever option would maximize the amount of pleasure in the world and minimize the amount of pain. Whether the option is within the law or outside the law is irrelevant, except in so far as any punishment that illegal actions might A tract should be factored into the person's calculation, but perhaps a more sophisticated version of utilitarianism can meet this objection. Bentham's version of utilitarianism, sometimes called out utilitarianism, judges individual actions directly against the utilitarianism, against the utilitarian requirement to maximize the pleasure and minimize the pain. In contrast, a more sophisticated version, sometimes called rule utilitarianism, introduces two stages. First one is potential rules are judged against the utilitarian requirement to maximize pleasure and minimize the pain, and the best rules are chosen accordingly. Individual actions are judged, right or wrong actions, against a rule regardless of how each action performs in terms of direct influence on the amount of pleasure and pain in the world. If we adopt the rule utilitarianism, then rather than the act of utilitarianism, then it is easier to see how we might construct a utilitarian case for political authority and obligation. The benefit that obedience to the law and existence of the state brings would be conducive to the promotion of pleasure and reduction of pain. As such, it seems quite plausible that a rule requiring obedience to the law would be among those rules most likely to maximize the pleasure and minimize the pain. This would only be true if the laws of the state in question were suitably designed. Then a rule utilitarian would also argue that the laws themselves should be chosen by utilitarian criteria. The problem with the utilitarian justification is for the political authority and obligation is that it is only as strong as the utilitarian moral theory itself. When the utilitarian does still have the supporters, most theories now tend to regard utilitarian as, or at best, an incomplete account of morality. In deciding how to act, we should take into account page number 19, not only the likely consequences for an action but also the considerations such as rights and justice. We should do so even when these other considerations demand that we act in ways that would not maximize the pleasure and minimize the pain. For example, we could imagine a situation in which utilitarianism required us to punish an innocent person pretending that he or she had committed a crime when in fact he or she has not done anything. So by making an example of innocent person, we might deter would-be criminals from causing greater pains in the long run. But most of us would think it wrong in any circumstances to punish an innocent person for the crime that he or she has not committed. Innocent persons have a right to liberty and we should not infringe that right. If utilitarianism requires us sometimes to punish innocent people, then utilitarianism cannot be the whole story. Note also we would think that innocent people should not be punished even if adopting the rule prohibiting their punishment were not conducive to maximization of pleasure and minimization of pain. Hence, the problem stands for both the act's rule and utilitarianism. Fairness. You might think that utilitarian defenses of political authority and obligation misconstrue the relevance that the benefits a state brings. Perhaps we should not look forward to the future benefits that obedience to the law would bring to the society in general, but look back to the benefits that each of us have already received from the state. Can these benefits justify a case for obedience to the law? The theorist H.L.A. argues that if we accept a benefit, then it is only fair that we should reciprocate and give something back. In this case, if we enjoy the protection of police and armies, we use road, hospitals, and other government-run services, then we should reciprocate it by obeying the laws. Not to do so would be free ride unfairly on the efforts of other hard rights. That when a number of persons conduct any joint enterprises according to the rules and thus restrict any liberty, those who have submitted their restrictions when required have a right to similar submission from those who have benefited by their submission. Page number 20. In other words, those who have willingly sacrificed their liberty in order to make possibly the benefits provided by the states have a right to expect that the rest of us who will receive the benefits do the same. Important objection to the view first put by Nozick denies that we can become a duty bound to reciprocate for the benefits that we would not requested. Suppose that any group could place you under an obligation to take part in their projects simply by foisting benefits on you regardless of how much you want them to do the benefits. This would Nozick argues, unfairly curtail your freedom to choose in your projects to involve yourself so as to best promote those ends that you yourself deem worth promoting. Nozick gives an example of neighborhood in which some people decide to start an entertainment program over the public address system. This initiators of the program draw up a list of everyone in their neighborhood, which includes you, and assign everyone a day during the year when the person is to run the program. No one except the organizer is asked whether they want to participate, but everyone in the neighborhood hears the broadcast. When your day come, have enjoyed the entertainment program thus far, the organizer expect you to run the program for the day. Nozick argues that this is unfair and you have no duty to show up. All of the pleasure that you derive from the broadcast over the past years might still not be worth the pleasure you would derive by spending the day doing something else. No one other than you has the right to decide how you should use your mind, time and resources to better promote the end users you are deemed worth promoting. Morality. Think about the law for a moment and about some of the things that it requires us to do. So the law forbids us to steal, to murder, to rape and to do a number of other activities that most of us would not dream of doing anyway, even if the law were not to exist. So it looks as though much of the law simply tells us not to do things that we already think we should do or we should not do out of independent sense of rigid and wrong. Perhaps then our duty to obey the law amounts to nothing more than the duty to obey the rules of the morality, which distinguishes right from the wrong. We do not need to consent to these rules in order to be bound by them, because we cannot opt in our demand of morality. One thing that we will be immediately apparent is that argument only requires obedience to just laws. The citizens of Nazi Germany or present-day Burma, for example, would not be required to obey the oppressive laws imposed by the government. But even liberal democracies tend to do a lot more than just enforce the basic rules of morality. They also tend to tell people what side of the road should we drive, steer the economy in favor of particular outcomes, and requires us to do a number of other things that are prime facie unrelated to morality. Quite which of these activities to fall beyond the remit of morality depends on what the rules of morality are. For example, disagreements about the rules of justice and equality in morality have implications for the permissibility of redistributive taxation. But however wide or narrow one's conception of morality, most theorists have tend to argue that morality alone cannot justify the authority the existing states claim for themselves. The minimal state. One theorist who famously argued for a particular narrow conception of morality, a liberation concept of morality, is Robert Nozick. In common with our liberation theorists, but in conflict with our schools of political theory, Nozick argues that justice prohibits a redistributive taxation that is aimed at promoting equality. Any government that enforces such taxation does so unjustly and illegitimately. According to Nozick, all the morality permits the state to do is to enforce basic property rights and rights against the harm. A state that restricted itself to enforcing only these rights would be legitimate but are quite different to the state that currently exists. Nozick calls his image and state a minimal state. A Nozical minimal state has legitimately enforced right, but the state do not just claim for themselves the authority to enforce rights, they also claim for themselves the authority uniquely to enforce the rights as to arbitrate in disputed cases. States do not permit private policies forces to run parallel system of enforcement with private courts and private prisons that are outside of the state controls. Can morality justify the authority of the authority of the state not only enforce right but uniquely to enforce the right. In PT1 of the page number 22, in PT1, Anarchy, State and Utopia, Nozick argues that the state may indeed act as unique enforcers of rights, prohibiting would-be private enforcers from setting up their own independent system of enforcement. His argument hinges on the risk that is involved in enforcing the rights, because law courts will sometimes make the wrong decision and convict innocent people. Enforcement is an inherently risky business. The state, Nozick argues, is entitled to stop would-be being private enforces from taking the risk with other people's lives, provided that the state itself enforces the right to those who are disadvantaged by its provision. Nozick's argument is ingenious and persuasive, but even if it succeeds, Nozick's argument shows only that people should obey the law insofar as to law matches morality, and that of the state may uniquely enforce the law insofar as by doing so it enforces morality. Nozick's argument cannot show the state any particular reason to expect the citizens to obey the law by the virtue of the fact that the state made the law, rather than by the virtue of the consent the law. That is, Nozick's argument may be argument for obedience to the law, but the obedience depends on the authority of morality rather than the authority of the state to issue directives out to be obeyed simply because they issue from the state. The normal justification thesis. Joseph Raz also argues that moral reasons are relevant to the justifications of political authority and obligation, but Raz, in contrast to Nozick, argues that at least some laws ought to be obeyed simply because they issue from the state. Raz argues that normal way to show that an authority is legitimate and ought not to be obeyed is to show that and ought not to be showed is that by following the directives of the authority we would be likely better to comply with the reasons that are applicable to us than if we were to try to follow reasons directly. These reasons include but are not limited to moral reasons for actions. If an authority tells us to do something that meets his criteria, then we are obliged to do what the authority tells us to do rather than decide ourselves how we should act. So, for example, all the car drives have reasons, both moral and self-interested, to avoid road accidents. These reasons would apply to car drivers even if the state did not exist or had said nothing about the road accident. One way in which the accidents can be avoided is if we all drive on the same side of the road, but we are unlikely to coordinate amongst ourselves to all drive of the same side of the road. On the other hand, the state can easily tell us to drive on this side of road or that. So if the state does tell us which side of the road to drive on, then we are duty bound to obey the state and to give up our own attempt to coordinate another solution without the state. This is because we are more likely to avoid road accidents by obeying the state than by continuing our individual efforts. Whether or not you agree in this account of authority, even Raz himself admit that the authority that existing state claims for themselves goes beyond the bounds of that which can be justified on Raz's account. Existing states will have some authority over people, but the extent of the authority will differ by person because each person is subject to quite different reason for action. Rarely will anyone be subject to political authority as extensively as existing states would like to claim that they are. Page number 23, Anarchy. Some thinkers who do not accept any of these arguments canvassed about argue instead that we are not bound by a duty to obey the law. Such thinkers do not necessarily think that we should abolish the state, because some accept that there are good prudential reasons to maintain the current order. It, at least for the time being, this position, anarchy in theory but not in practice, is known as philosophical anarchism and was first proposed by William Godwin 1793 to 1976. Of the positive arguments for philosophical anarchism, those built on reasons not to obey the law rather than merely the absence of reasons to obey it, the most widely discussed in recent times has been the claims of R.P. Wolf 1970 that we should not obey the law because obedience that requires the law us to neglect our primary obligation to account autonomously. This obligation requires us to act on the basis of our own moral judgments about situations and not to let the state decide right and wrong on our behalf. In order to fulfill this obligation, we must refuse to surrender any part of our autonomy to the state. Yet Wolf does not defend his claim that a primary obligation is to act autonomously, and a number of theorists have rejected our claim. So even if Wolf is right that a duty to act autonomously is incompatible with the duty to obey the law, it is nevertheless remains an open question whether we should therefore choose autonomy over obedience to the law. Not all anarchists, of course, are as reluctant as philosophical anarchists to put their anarchy into practice. The anarchist vision of the world that is free from state coercion has attracted revolutionaries from 19th century when the great anarchist theorists Stirner, Proudhon, Bakunin and Kropotkin held sway to the present day. While anarchy is often portrayed as chaotic, violent from the society, anarchists themselves have argued that anarchist society could be more peaceful and harmonious than a statist society. A society governed by the state can ever be. The modern anarchist theorist Colin Ward 1996 goes as far as to claim that war is the expression of the state in its most perfect form. It is the finest hour. Among the key issues at the state between anarchists and statists are belief about human nature. Anarchists adopt more optimistic beliefs about the possibilities for the cooperative behavior in the absence of state, whereas statists are more pessimistic. One of the ways in which anarchists have tried to lend the credence to their view of human nature is by pointing to anarchist experiments that have been and continue to be and tried in various localities. Two of the most notable anarchist experiments include the Paris Commune of 1871, the Spanish Revolution of 1936. Critics of anarchism often respond to such examples by arguing that even if anarchy is feasible on a smaller scale, it could not be made to work on a larger scale. Taking on this response in his book Anarchy in Action 1996, Ward powerfully argues that there is no need to ask whether anarchy could work because anarchy is already all around us, whether or not we realize it. The modes of organization that structure our lives are Ward argues largely anarchic. Page number 26. Conclusion. We begin with the question why should we obey the law? We have looked at the range of different answers to this question, each appealing to different moral principles. Each answer tries with varying degrees of success to show that we should obey the law in order to fulfill the moral principle, or that in order to do what we have consented to do, in order to maximize pleasure and minimize the pain, in order to honor duties of fairness, etc. Each argument has its merits and its own weaknesses. In the light of this, one option is to take round view and conclude that although no argument is perfect taken together, then the probably amount of limited case, but only limited case for obedience to the law and respect for the political authority. Example, Wolf 2000 and Klosko 2005. Very few theorists would maintain that states may act however they want without overstepping the bounds of legitimate authority. As such, we should support the state when it acts within the authority, but not to be afraid to hold it account whether it goes beyond that point. This raises the question of when and how we may disobey the law in order to keep political authorities in check. Various social movements throughout the history have used illegal protests as an effective means to challenge what they have regarded as illegitimate or moral laws. In case study that follows, we will explore the issues through the perspective of one social movement that has risen to prominence in recent time, the global justice movement. The key points given. Page number 17. Consent theorists. Page number 17, key point. Consent theories claim that we should obey the law because we have consented to do. Second point, modern consent theorists rely on the Lockean notion of tacit consent. Tacit consent has been interpreted in different ways but is most usefully interpreted as consent by doing something that you would not otherwise be permitted to do because someone has a right that you not do the thing without thereby consenting. Point number 3. Some consent theorists argue that the residents in a geographical territory count as tacit consent to obey the law. One objection to this claim says that we are not free enough to leave our country of our birth of our residence to count as effective consent. Another objection suggests that residing on one's own land is not a prohibited act and cannot be therefore counted as tacit consent. Point number 4. Some consent theories argue that voting is a democratic election counts as tacit consent to obey the law, but as long as those who do not vote are forced to obey the law despite their abstention, it seems reasonable to treat voting as covert and therefore ineffective consent. Point number 5. Hypothetical consent theories argue that we would consent to set up a state and obey the law if the state did not really exist. The difficulty for the hypothetical consent theorists is to explain why it should matter morally what we would do rather than what we have in fact. Key point, box 2, page number 19. Point 1. Utilitarianism is a moral theory that says everything we should do aim to maximize the amount of pleasure and minimize the amount of pain in the world. Point number 2. Some theorists have tried to ground a case of political authority and obligation in utilitarianism, appealing to the benefits of society and obedience to the state. Point number 3. Most theorists now see utilitarianism as an incomplete account of morality. It may require us to do things that conflict with our intuitive moral judgment about justice and right, such as punishing innocent people for crimes they have not committed. Even the rule utilitarianism fails correctly to explain why we think that such acts should be prohibited. Key points, page number 20. Point 1. Hatt argues that we have a duty of fairness to obey the law in return for the benefits that we have received from the state, made up possibly by our fellow citizens' obedience to the law. Point number 2. Nozick rejects that the appeal to fairness, arguing that people should not be forced to participate in joint projects when they may prefer to use their time and resources.
Chapter 4, Political Obligation. Introduction. Political obligation is a broad notion and covers many things. Some have said, for example, that the citizen has an obligation or duty to vote. Others have claimed that citizens may have a duty to serve their country and possible even to fight in its defense. Most people who talk of political obligation, however, have one thing in their particular in mind. The citizen's duty is to obey the laws in their own country. The issue I want to discuss in this chapter is whether people do in fact have good or justifiable reasons for complying with laws that go beyond mere fear of punishment, and if so, whether they are bound or obligated by those reasons to comply. 1. One main argument for a duty to obey the law: consent. Socrates had to decide whether to disobey an unjust but legal decision. The remarkable thing is that he decided to obey for what he thought were sound reasons, in circumstances that would cost him his life. Socrates believed people had a moral duty to obey the law. It is a very strict duty based on an agreement they have made. What is distinctive about the agreement argument Socrates assented to in the Crito is that it puts the issue in terms of justice and morality. In our own political tradition, there is an argument somewhat like Socratic one. It stresses not the morality of keeping agreements, but rather the connection between a legitimately constituted government, on the other hand, and a citizen's duty to obey the valid laws issued by such a government on the other. This obligation is a strict one. It attaches to all laws and can be overridden, if at all, only in exceptional cases. In this theory, usually associated with Hobbes and Locke, in particular, a contract, sometimes called consent to government, is said both to authorize a government to make laws and to bind subjects to strict obedience. Actually, the theories of Hobbes and Locke are not quite so simple as this. Locke argues that at a certain point, that is, upon reaching the age of adulthood, and then by staying on more or less voluntarily in the face of an unexercised right of emigration, people become members or parts of a particular body politic. The main function of any such body is to create a constitution or form of government, and presumably there is a consensus, what Locke calls a majority, among the citizens as to where, that is, in what institutions the main powers of government, legislative, executive, etc., have been lodged. Indeed, Locke says if there were not this consensus, the body politic would become apart and would simply disintegrate and could only be held together by obvious and clear improper force. Now, from these two facts, that one is a member of a body politic and that there is a consensually based constitutional government for it, it follows for Locke, as a matter of logic, that each citizen, each member of a political society so organized, is strictly bound to obey the laws duly issued by such a constitutional government, or it follows from these two facts plus one another. If laws were not obeyed, people would in fact have returned to the other. That each member has a strict obligation in question. One has, in short, not consented, contracted, promised, in so many words, to obey the laws. Rather, one has consented to be a member of a body politic, and from that fact, plus one or two others, it follows logically that the citizen has a strict duty to obey laws duly issued. One is thus obliged as if one had in fact expressively consented to obey. The doctrine of consent in Hobbes is perhaps simpler. Hobbes argues that all subjects of all governments consent in one and the same fundamental way. They simply stand aside from their own exercise of natural rights, from the right to do anything they are physically able to do. Thus, each subject has individually consented, or in fact promised, permanently but conditionally, to waive the exercise in deference to the exercise of that same right, the right to do anything, by the government. Hence, the subjects consent to be under the sovereign's will and are obliged to comply with it, whatever it is, in all or almost all cases. For the contract theorist, just as for Socrates' idea of an agreement, the relationship of citizens to the government and its laws is construed on an analogy with some non political undertaking, like promising, agreeing, consenting, or signing in a contract, which is obligation creating in character. It is the fact of agreement or the act of consent that grounds the obligation to obey the law in all these theories. I can see two main problems with this overall approach. First, there is the problem of what counts as consent. Second, there is a problem of whether consent so conceived can really bind people to obey all or almost all valid laws, simply because these laws were issued in the correct way by a legitimate or effective government. What counts as consent? All of the theorists count mere residence, permanent residence during adulthood. Hobbes adds the interesting twist that a resident could even bow one's head and go on living under a conqueror on pain of death if such consent were not given, and that would fully count as consent. Many people are reluctant to think that mere continued residence should count, especially under the condition Hobbes envisioned as having exactly the force of an explicit and solemn promise. Some have said that voting in a free election should so count. Well, so voting might commit you to accepting the outcome of the election, we might grant. But why should it commit you to accepting, being obliged to accept all the laws issued by those who elected? Some of those laws might be foolish or unconstitutional or even wicked. Suppose you voted on the losing side. Your candidate did not win. You voted the way because you did not want a certain bad law passed. And now the candidate you voted against has, along with others, supported the very law. Or suppose it was really a wicked law, like the US law in the 1850s, which required runaway slaves to be recaptured and returned to their owners, and you were a voter in the state of Massachusetts who did not like the idea of such a law and who had voted for a candidate who opposed it. A candidate who was then elected but whose votes against this law was then defeated in the next meeting of the national legislature. These examples suggest that it goes a bit far to say that simply by voting in a general election you are committed to accepting this law and are obliged to obey it. But what about an explicit and solemn promise, a full bodied agreement to accept all valid laws and to be bound by them? Would that work? Not too well. Most citizens have never consented or contracted in a way that can be regarded as really counting to obey laws of the country in which they reside. For example, not everyone, certainly not every citizen, has engaged in a meaningful act of consent in Britain or America or Canada. In fact, relatively few people there have done so. Therefore, if full bodied actual consent is required, the contract theory cannot account for an obligation to obey the law in such countries. One should always reply, well, if everyone had freely and explicitly promised to obey the laws in our own country in a solemn oath of some sort, that would surely count. We could still ask, even if such a promise counted as consent, whether such explicit consent would or could bind those who had taken that oath, could oblige them to obey all the valid laws of the land simply because they were the country's laws. Is the strict obligation to obey laws grounded merely in the bare existence of consent to do so, or is it grounded in whatever good reasons, excluding fear of punishment, of course, one might have for so consenting in the first place? Clearly, if simply we cited the reasons but without an act of explicit consent by the people involved, then we no longer have actual consent as the ground of obligation, contrary to what the contract theory requires. Suppose, though, we cited both the fact of an explicit and widespread agreement in a given country and good reasons for making such an agreement. one could still question whether the fact of explicit consent really added anything to these reasons. Consider if we regard our obligation to obey our country's laws as a moral obligation, as did Socrates in the Crito, then we probably also believe that most and very many of these laws have a good moral content, so such as do the laws that prohibit murder, kidnap, rape, or physical assault. But would not the prohibitions in such laws, given their good moral content, control your conduct, morally speaking, even if they were not set down in law? By the same token, they would also control our conduct, morally speaking, even if we had never explicitly or solemnly promised to obey the laws of the land. The matter becomes more complicated when we consider laws that are morally indifferent. I would think a question of moral obligation could arise in such cases only where what the law required, for example, the payment of income taxes, could be shown to be necessary or substantially important to the government's continuing ability to encourage people's compliance with those laws that do have a morally good content. When we come to wicked laws, laws with a bad moral content, like the fugitive slave law mentioned earlier or Nazi laws against the Jews, I think the matter changes considerably from what it was in the two earlier cases, the case of laws with good moral content and the case of laws with morally neutral content. I do not think it is possible to ground the moral precept of obedience to law on a foundation of indifference with respect to whether the laws are, in most cases and in the long run, of a morally good or at least a morally acceptable content. The moral presumption here is surely against evil laws, and this presumption will tell against any morally based obligation to obey such laws. In the analysis, we have given a promise to obey evil laws could not be morally justified, and any such promise, even the promise to obey all laws, just and unjust, would not have obliging weight. Second, another main argument for a duty to obey law: benefit. Dissatisfaction with consent theory has led political theorists to consider other possible grounds of an obligation to obey law. What follows is perhaps the most commonly cited alternative. It is often alleged that the receipt of benefits obliges one, as based on a proper sense of gratitude, to show appropriate responsive conduct. Some have said, as it was said for example as Plato's Crito, that when the benefit comes from the government, the appropriate responsive conduct is to obey the laws. Of course, some benefits are open, they come to everyone, and one can hardly help but receive them, like breathing clean air as a result of anti pollution measures. Sometimes the benefits come even though one actively tries to avoid them. Many of my neighbors actively opposed the city building sidewalks along our street, but now they use those pavements like anyone else. But some benefits are positively sought and accepted, or are at least voluntarily received, knowingly and willingly. These, it might be said, are the ones for which one clearly owes a duty of gratitude, and appropriate responsive conduct is owed to the benefactor. The question is, though, where these benefits are positively sought or voluntarily received from government, does one owe obedience to law as one feature, perhaps the main feature, of one's appropriate responsive conduct? Does one indeed have an obligation to obey all the laws on such a basis? Consider the following example. A black student, aged 19, in South Africa during the period of apartheid, requests and receives admission to a state run high school and some monetary aid to cover cost and fees from a local education authority, support that is paid for out of tax revenues. Suppose it is believed that the students might now owe a debt of gratitude to be paid back in some sort of appropriate responsive conduct. But what conduct is appropriate? Contributing to state supported education in the future through donation of one's time or contributing financially to a scholarship fund might well be, but it can hardly be alleged that now one is obliged, morally obligated, to support the government and obey all its laws, including the laws that maintain apartheid. The same could be said of a white student in similar circumstances. That student might be thought of to be obliged to contribute to state supported education in the future, but there is no good reason to state that the student who has probably received more benefits overall than the black student is morally obligated any more than is the black student to support the government and obey all its laws. Indeed, we could vary the picture somewhat to include important benefits people receive but without assuming their voluntary acceptance. For instance, both our students, black and white, might have benefited greatly from the public health measures, clean water, sanitation, vaccination, and other diseases control programs. Would it follow from this that either is morally obligated to support the government and obey all its laws? The basic point I am making that there is no obligation to obey all the laws of the land in such cases would probably hold even if the evil apartheid laws were completely removed from the picture. The fundamental question here is whether the appropriate responsive conduct said to be owed in these cases of education and public health can reasonably be thought to include supporting the government and obeying all its laws. More to the point, if you were to run through a wide number of cases of various benefits actively sought or voluntarily received from government or of important benefits merely received and reach the same conclusion in each case, then you do not think gratitude for benefits received does ground an obligation for recipients to obey all the laws of their country. Some have pointed to a special version of benefit theory called fair play to make the case for a duty to obey law. Here is the picture they present. People are engaged in a joint activity, a practice, or an enterprise that is widely beneficial, like conserving water in time of drought or reducing electricity use in the face of the brownout, a partial blackout. The benefits of this activity can only be obtained if most people join in, but doing so carries certain cost for each of them. For example, I cannot water my lawn, you cannot wash your car. Now, let us say that I, a university student, am engaged in such a practice in a scheme of things in which others are doing to benefit me, like paying their taxes, and I have voluntarily accepted these benefits. Now it comes my turn, after a few years have passed, to pay taxes, for I have now entered a work-a-day world. Fair play theory alleges that I am obligated by my participation in this practice, in particular through my voluntary receipt of benefits and the cost to others of these benefits being provided, to do my share to return in kind the benefits I have received by paying my taxes. And this means complying with the tax laws. To keep matters simple, let us suppose that these laws are not unfair. Technically, the obligation I owe under the fair play is to the other participants in a joint activity. It can become an obligation to obey the law only indirectly in so as far as the activity itself is essentially or significantly involved with one's being law abiding. This said, I cannot quarrel with the analysis just given. The question, though, is whether you or I have an obligation to obey all the laws. The same thought experiment I suggested earlier would work here as well to help answer this question. The issue we are raising here is whether the appropriate responsive conduct said to be owed in this one case of receipt of benefits from tax revenues raised and spent can reasonably be thought to go beyond conformity to the tax laws to include supporting the government and obeying all its laws. Surely it does not, and if we took each practice up in turn, one after the other, we would reach the same conclusion in each case. Thus, a person who had benefited from other people's obedience to laws against theft should obey those some laws, were the circumstances to arise. You owe it to these authors in fair play so to act. But there would be no generalized duty, a duty that went beyond conformity to anti theft laws to obey all the government's laws. Indeed, if you ran through a wide number of cases envisioning people's participation in a variety of practices or joint activities where they voluntarily received benefits in each of them and lumped them all together, you might conclude that the person involved should do their share to pay back in kind the benefits they have received. This may well involve a duty to obey several, even many laws. But none of this would mandate the conclusion that fair play in the case of benefits voluntarily received by participants in a wide variety of practices would ground an obligation for each of them to obey all the laws of their country. Obedience to some laws may not benefit everyone, and obedience to some laws might not benefit anyone. The conclusions reached in our survey of fair play are, of course, strengthened when we consider that some laws may be evil, like the Nazi laws against the Jews or the apartheid laws in South Africa, and that such evil laws cannot benefit literally everyone. And if any are benefited in such cases, and some would be by wicked laws, as were slave owners in the slave system, for instance, there is no moral obligation, no obligation of fair play, even for them, let alone for the persons victimized by such laws, to obey all the laws of the land. Third, a preliminary conclusion and some materials for a new start. We have now canvassed some of the main arguments for a generalized duty, a duty of everyone to obey all laws. The arguments based on consent, on gratitude for benefits, and on fair play have been looked at in turn, and each has failed. Some have concluded from this that there simply is no obligation, no moral obligation for everyone to obey all laws in their own country. In fact, there may not be a standing obligation for some at least to obey any of the laws. Others, looking at the same sample, have concluded that none of the standard arguments will work, but these theorists have left open that another radically different approach might work. And some have even suggested the main lines of such an approach. I tend to side with the second view, suitably qualified. The theorists we have been criticizing all treat the obligation to obey the law as primarily as moral one, and thus the grounds they emphasize are distinctively moral grounds. These theorists are interested in general grounds for obeying the law, grounds operative in all and almost all societies, grounds that would cover all laws and conceivably all persons, and they disdain reasons which are local or distinctive only of a particular society or specific kind of system. But their analysis, by its very nature, creates a deep problem. They cannot show that the duties are so generated by reference to these general, distinctively moral grounds, received or fair play, can ever be duties of all people in a given country to obey all the laws there. Or so I have argued. The quest for such generality has proven to be a hopeless and unrewarding one. The second feature of a standard approach also needs bringing out. The favored grounds cited in this approach all have in common they invoke some voluntary act on an agent's part. Typically, the agents are here said voluntarily to have consented, or alternatively voluntarily to have received benefits, or yes, yet another alternative to have knowingly participated in a practice or joint activity from which they have voluntarily received benefits of the very sort they are now being asked to provide in return. The main point relied on in all these cases is the same. Having an obligation implies that one has voluntarily taken on that obligation through some sort of morally approvable transaction. This pronounced emphasis on voluntariness may be out of place. One can have duties that are not based on voluntary acts at all. For example, children, say teenagers, could have duties to their parents which are not based on voluntary transaction on a young person's part. Among the benefits they have received are many that were not voluntary sought or voluntary taken. For example, enormous number of such benefits they received when they were infants or very young children. More to the point, it may be the relationship they are in with their parents that counts entirely or for the most part for the duties they have. Consider now a parallel case. The requirement on people's conduct that the law imposes are often there because of the status these individuals have as innkeeper or employer, or quite typically as member and fellow citizen in a given political society. The normative directions for conduct laid down in the law often come with the territory and are imposed simply by the rule making actions of government officials. These requirements are thus unlike standard voluntary obligation in a number of important aspects. They do not necessarily involve undertakings or determinate transactions that serve to bring a citizen specifically under a given requirement. They are not in and typically cases owed to definite or named individuals, but rather to all citizens. They are not imposed because the individual has been the actual beneficiary of the very way of acting which that individual is now being normatively directed to engage in, and so on. This last point is in deliberate contrast with fair play. We need, in short, to be able to discuss the duty one might have to conform to the such laws without assuming that the duty is there on the basis of some voluntary undertaking or determinate transaction that has served to bring the citizens specifically under the requirement. Another dimension to this important matter of voluntariness needs mention as well. Most people are in fact citizens or lifelong members of one only country during their entire lifetimes. They are born in that one country and they will spend their whole lives there. Many others have joined them for reasons of their own and have in fact cast their lots there. This we must grant. But we must be able to make a case for a duty to obey laws for this vast majority, those who were born there. If we are going to have any serious case for the claim that citizens have or may have a duty to conform to laws, We need, in short, to be able to discuss the duty one might have to conform to laws in the country of their birth without assuming that the duty is there and can only be there on the basis of some voluntary undertaking or determinate transaction that has served to bring the citizen specifically under that duty. One final point is worth making. People often talk about duty to conform to the law, which